Dwayne Johnson. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson built an entire career on playing variations of the same character, the unstoppable slab of charisma who smiles through danger and solves every problem with either a punch or a motivational speech. The Mummy Returns and The Scorpion King set the blueprint early, a physically imposing figure whose presence did most of the acting for him. Luke Hobbs arrived when Johnson entered the Fast and Furious franchise, a government agent with the personality of a protein shake and the diplomacy of a sledgehammer. The limited range becomes visible through rhythm, the raised eyebrow, the confident pacing, the forced sincerity, and the bulletproof charm that eventually replaced actual vulnerability. During the filming of The Rundown in the early 2000s, the studio deliberately asked him to stop doing the signature eyebrow raise from his wrestling days because it was distracting test audiences. The Rundown remains one of the rare films where he briefly played an actual character instead of a motivational avatar. Central Intelligence became another anomaly, allowing him to lean into insecurity rather than invincibility, switching roles with Kevin Hart and playing a socially awkward CIA operative with emotional softness instead of stoic strength. These moments show the version of Johnson that could have existed, the one with comedic fragility and human awkwardness, but Hollywood learned that audiences paid far more for his invincible persona than for his nuance. Kevin Hart. Kevin Hart's career runs on a very specific performance style: the rapid-fire delivery, the high-pitched panic, and the non-stop commentary that turns every scene into a stand-up routine. Ride along, think like a man, and get hard all repeat the same comedic structure, the anxious underdog who overreacts to everything while orbiting around a larger, calmer co-star. That rhythm became so recognizable that entire scripts were built around waiting for him to yell, stumble, or deliver a frantic monologue that sounded like it came straight from a comedy special. Hart shifts out of that persona so rarely that even big ensemble movies like Jumanji, where the premise gives every actor room to stretch, still trap him in the same energetic bundle of fear and frustration. The camera relies on his volume rather than his subtlety, because subtlety remains the one tool he almost never brings out. The Upside, a 2019 remake of a French drama, gave Hart the role of an ex-convict caretaker opposite Bryan Cranston. During production, the director intentionally reduced the number of comedic takes Hart attempted, asking him to slow his speech and hold silence longer than he ever does in comedy. The result becomes one of the few performances where Hart's emotional restraint turns into an asset, especially in scenes where he discusses purpose and regret. This proved he could calibrate his energy into something grounded, but after the film's release, he immediately returned to playing the same hyperactive comedic template that made him globally marketable. Jason Statham. Jason Statham's entire catalog operates on one dependable frequency: the stoic, unbreakable, gravel-voiced enforcer who handles every situation with the same expression and the same tightly coiled intensity. Crank, The Transporter, and Safe all present him as the solitary bruiser who solves problems through precision violence, minimal dialogue, and unwavering confidence. Physical presence does the heavy lifting rather than emotional variation, which explains why his characters across franchises blend together so seamlessly that you could swap scenes between films with almost no tonal disruption. The structure of his roles rarely changes. Conflict arrives, he delivers clipped lines loaded with controlled anger, defeats every threat with martial efficiency, and exits without undergoing any internal shift. Even in ensemble films like The Expendables, his contribution stays identical: the grim, straight man who throws knives, glares at enemies, and rarely deviates from his hardened demeanor. Statham competed as a diver for Great Britain during the 1980s and early 1990s, a discipline that influenced the fluidity and precision of his stunt work. Directors have noted that Statham's diving training allowed him to perform complex action choreography with unusual balance, which explains why he performs the majority of his own stunts. Despite this athletic versatility, his emotional range on-screen remains narrow, with roles built around the same cold determination. Even when given opportunities for variation, such as his comedic turn in Spy, the misdirection relies on subverting his existing persona rather than revealing a new one. Reliability defines his range, not change. Gal Gadot. Gal Gadot's screen presence builds almost entirely on poise, composure, and visual iconography rather than emotional variation. Wonder Woman in the 2017 film relies heavily on silent expressions, slow-motion poses, and symbolic gravitas instead of layered acting choices. Red Notice, Heart of Stone, and the later Fast and Furious entries all maintain the same calm, slightly distant delivery that creates an impression of strength but offers very little tonal flexibility. Dialogue gets written to accommodate the limited shifts in cadence, expression, and emotional depth she consistently brings to roles, with performances often sculpted around her appearance. Line readings commonly stay flat and steady regardless of emotional stakes, which explains why the most memorable moments in her career usually end up being the visual ones, such as the trench charge sequence in Wonder Woman or the breaking glass standoff in Fast and Furious 6. The camera does the heavy lifting, framing her as an emblem rather than a character, which makes her lack of range less noticeable in spectacle-driven scenes. Gadot originally auditioned for the Bond girl role in Quantum of Solace, but instead of being cast, The director encouraged her to pursue more physically demanding work due to her 2 years of service in the Israeli Defense Forces. That military background later influenced how she was choreographed, with fight scenes adjusted to highlight real combat familiarity. Despite this added authenticity, her performances outside action sequences rarely expand beyond the same serene, controlled presence that has defined her entire filmography. Vin Diesel. Vin Diesel's career anchors to a single cinematic identity, the husky-voiced minimalist, who speaks in short, heavy sentences and radiates unwavering loyalty. Toretto, in the Fast and Furious franchise, demonstrates how tightly he adheres to this persona, with nearly every major scene centered on themes of family, honor, or vengeance, delivered with the same calm intensity, regardless of context. Triple X, The Last Witch Hunter, and Babylon AD repeat the same blueprint outside the franchise, positioning him as a lone warrior defined by strength and minimal emotional variation. Even when storylines present opportunities for vulnerability, such as losing characters close to him in later Fast installments, Diesel's tone remains consistent, the deep-voiced monotone that rarely shifts pitch or rhythm. Physical stillness reinforces the limited range, as he favors slow, controlled movements over expressive body language. These traits make his catalog remarkably uniform, with characters blending together through their identical speech patterns and emotional restraint. Diesel once worked as a club bouncer under the name Diesel, a detail that influenced his obsession with projecting toughness in his roles. He also directed a small independent film titled Multifacial in the mid-1990s, which explored racial identity and casting discrimination, and that short caught the attention of Steven Spielberg, who cast him in Saving Private Ryan. Despite this early hint of versatility, Diesel quickly shifted into action-centric roles that require very little emotional range. The dominance of the Fast franchise solidified his persona, making him one of Hollywood's most recognizable yet least transformative performers. Jack Black. Jack Black's acting style builds around high-energy enthusiasm, exaggerated expressions, and a musical rhythm that turns most of his dialogue into playful performance. School of Rock, Nacho Libre, and the Jumanji reboots rely on the same core traits: the wide-eyed excitement, the dramatic vocal inflections, and the constant comedic physicality that leaves almost no room for stillness or emotional subtlety. Characters often feel interchangeable because they share the same comedic cadence, bouncing between confidence, panic, and theatrical charm without ever shifting into deeper dramatic territory. Different professions and genres, such as a teacher, wrestler, explorer, or fantasy adventurer, all get the same over-the-top persona from Black. Directors frequently shape entire scenes around his improvisational style, allowing him to dominate the tone with rapid comedic beats instead of exploring varied emotional registers. Reliability for comedy comes easy, but his range shrinks when scripts require quiet intensity or internal struggle. Bernie. The 2011 film where he portrays real-life funeral director Bernie Tiede stands out as a clear exception. Black restrains his usual comedic excess, channeling his charm into controlled, unsettling warmth. Black spent extended time in the real Bernie Tiede's hometown during production, even attending local church services to understand his singing style and mannerisms. This immersion informed the film's gospel and hymn scenes, where Black performs with surprising delicacy. Bernie remains one of the rare instances where his natural exuberance becomes a tool for layered characterization rather than a comedic crutch, revealing a potential range he rarely uses. Ryan Reynolds. Ryan Reynolds' career gets shaped almost entirely around a single comedic identity: the quick-witted, self-aware, endlessly sarcastic protagonist who treats every situation like an opportunity for a punchline. Van Wilder in the early 2000s to Deadpool, in the mid-2010s to Free Guy and Red Notice, all repeat the same rhythm: fast-paced quips, meta-commentary, and a charming detachment that makes emotional scenes feel secondary to humor. Line delivery rarely changes, using the same cadence whether he's playing a superhero, a bank teller, or a covert agent, which gives his entire filmography a uniform tone. Charisma does the work rather than transformation, even in ensemble films like The Hitman's Bodyguard, where the dynamic revolves around him reacting with irritation or comedic disbelief. Characters typically face danger with jokes before fear, and dramatic tension often gets undercut by humor, limiting the emotional variation available on screen. Consistency comes at the cost of predictability, with scripts frequently built around his brand rather than his adaptability. During the early production of Deadpool, Reynolds personally financed portions of the development process after the studio hesitated to support an R-rated superhero film. He also kept the Deadpool suit after filming ended, which the studio normally prohibits, because he believed the character was inseparable from his identity. This dedication shaped one of his most iconic roles, but also locked him into a persona he continues to repeat. Even when playing serious scenes, such as moments of loss in Deadpool 2, his emotional tone remains similar, blending levity with sincerity in a manner that rarely shifts beyond his established range. Megan Fox. Megan Fox's on-screen presence gets shaped largely by stillness, composure, and a detached delivery that rarely shifts tone or emotional weight. The 2007 and 2009 Transformers films positioned her as a visual focal point rather than a character with narrative depth, limiting her performance to smirks, glances, and understated reactions. Jonah Hex, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and Think Like a Dog continued that pattern, where she carried the same soft-spoken, guarded persona that never fully adapts to the genre around her. Line readings often avoid dramatic escalation even when the script invites higher emotional stakes, with acting that feels intentionally muted. This restraint makes her catalog consistent but narrow, with characters defined more by appearance than transformation. Directors frequently structure her roles around silence, reaction shots, and minimal dialogue, which further reinforces how small her expressive range tends to be. Yet when placed in the right tone, her detachment becomes an asset, especially in horror and thriller settings. Jennifer's Body and Till Death both use her distant demeanor as part of the character's psychology rather than a limitation. The controlled confidence in Jennifer's Body enhances the unsettling mix of charm and menace, while in Till Death, the near-expressionless focus works as a survival instinct. Fox handled several practical stunt elements herself during the filming of Jennifer's Body, including the lake scene shot in near-freezing conditions, because she believed the physical discomfort would help control the character's stillness. These moments show how her naturally reserved temperament can serve a role effectively, even if her overall range remains limited. Keanu Reeves remains one of Hollywood's most recognizable performers, yet his acting range stays notably narrow, built around calm stoicism, controlled speech, and minimal emotional variation. Speed, Point Break, The Matrix, and the John Wick franchise all carry the same delivery, marked by slow pacing, emphasized pauses, and a gentle monotone that rarely shifts regardless of stakes. This style creates an otherworldly presence that works well for roles involving isolation, destiny, or quiet determination, but flexibility suffers when scripts call for expressive emotional depth. Many of his most iconic moments rely on physicality or visual design rather than dramatic transformation. Dodging bullets or choosing the red pill in The Matrix centers on concept rather than performance intricacy, while in John Wick, the emotional weight of losing his wife and dog gets conveyed more through silence and action choreography than nuanced dialogue. Reeves excels at embodying characters who absorb the world with stillness instead of reacting with visible intensity, which gives his catalog a strong thematic consistency but a narrow expressive palette. Reeves performed roughly 90% of his own gun handling and martial arts sequences in the first John Wick film, training for months with competitive shooters to refine his technique. This commitment to physical authenticity explains why his action roles stand out, giving his characters credibility even without a wide emotional range. Performances succeed when the narrative leans into his quiet presence, but they rarely stray far from the same soft-spoken, introspective style that defines his entire filmography. Mark Wahlberg's screen identity builds around a consistent blend of confusion, intensity, and tough guy earnestness. Shooter, Mile 22, Contraband, Planet of the Apes, and the Transformers sequels frequently place him in situations where he reacts to danger with the same strained delivery, the wide-eyed stare, the abrupt questioning tone, and the clipped sentences that make every scene sound like an interrogation. Physical tension does more work than emotional nuance, creating a catalog where most roles feel like variations of the same Boston-shaped mold. Different genres repeat the pattern. Ted and the Other Guys use the same agitated cadence, only redirected toward punchlines instead of threats, while in action and drama, the agitation simply shifts toward enemies or crises. Facial expressions rarely soften, and his emotional range tends to stay within a small spectrum: confusion, frustration, determination, and occasional sentimental sincerity. During the filming of Three Kings, Wahlberg asked director David O. Russell to make his interrogation and torture scenes more intense so the character's fear would feel authentic. The request came from Wahlberg's belief that his performance needed physical pressure to look convincing, reflecting how much he depends on external stakes rather than internal variation. Three Kings and The Fighter remain rare points where vulnerability briefly enters his acting, especially in scenes where he defers to Christian Bale's character. Despite these moments, Wahlberg largely settled into roles that match his natural energy, making him dependable but limited in range across decades of work. If breaking down these limited ranges kept you hooked, the video on your screen goes even deeper, so click it now.